Possibly the most successful Paralympic Games to date. With a record number of tickets sold and more people tuning in than ever before, the Paralympic movement was as strong as it's ever been. But the build-up to Rio has been beset with serious problems.
A month ago, when the International Paralympic Committee revealed there was no money, many feared the Paralympic movement was about to take a backward step.
We should not be taking out our begging bowls. We understand that people are living in difficult times, but what we don't understand is why we have to be an afterthought every time. Why should these games be staged on a shoestring?
Despite emergency measures like moving a fence and reducing transport facilities, ticket sales are on the up and the athletes are ready. For the British team and their famous faces, their one and only concern now is winning.
People might be looking negative, but I think everyone will be pleasantly surprised, and I think when people see the performances of British athletes, especially going out and getting gold medals, I think it'll all be forgotten about.
Over 4,000 athletes from more than 160 countries will join thousands of volunteers. The Games are about to begin, but perhaps here in Rio, the Paralympic movement has already passed its hardest test.
Well, Nikki's also been speaking to the president of the International Paralympic Committee, Sir Philip Craven, about that troubled build-up to the Games in Rio.
It seems like years ago now, but it's about 4 weeks ago, or 5 weeks ago, when we started to realise the mess that they were in, particularly from a financial point of view, and no money. I think the organising committee Rio were in a state of hyper stress, and we had to get hold of some of the facts. And once we got some of the facts, we could get to work. And we made close contact with the acting federal government, of course, at that time, and the city authorities through the Mayor Pais, and progress started to be made. And I've just been to the village now. The athletes are all pretty happy with where they're at. And we're going to have great games.
There was a real sense, wasn't there, that it was
well,
dire, it was as bad as it
was
could
true.
get.
It couldn't get any worse.
Were there any warning signs? Did the IPC have any warning signs that this was happening, that this money was being diverted to the Olympics?
Not really. Well, those are your words, actually. I think what happened was the organising committee ran out of money. And therefore the consequence was pretty serious for the Olympics, but absolutely dire for the Paralympics. And so I'm not talking about whether money was transferred here or there, just there wasn't going to be any.
Sir Philip Craven, who is president of the International Paralympic Committee. Well, let's go live to Rio now, and our correspondent, Kate Gray. Kate, first of all, I mean, how much excitement is there in Brazil about the Paralympics? What's the atmosphere like?
Well, as I stand here looking over the newly named Paralympic Park, I can hear final preparations taking place. There's drums in the background, and there feels a real sense of the Paralympic spirit has arrived here. Despite all the problems there's been in the lead up to those games, with overspends at the Olympic Games, wondering whether they were going to be able to finish venues and bring the teams to these games, it feels now that all of that has been put to bed and they're ready to put on a great show. I actually went for a wander along Copacabana Beach yesterday, and the Olympic rings have been replaced by the agitos, and the public were taking photos. They're really starting to embrace these Paralympic Games. And I think the sign of the increase in ticket sales is proof that the Brazilian people now really believe that it's time to support the Paralympics and fill up those stands.
So the opening ceremony in just under 3 hours' time, the sporting action starting on Thursday. What are we looking out for?
Well, as you said, there's over 4,300 athletes competing here across 528 gold medal events. So there's so much action to look out for. I have to mention the poster boy of these Paralympic Games for Rio. It's Daniel Diaz. He's competing in the aquatic centre just behind me. He's competing in 9 events. Now, he is Brazil's most successful Paralympian, so he's got nothing to prove, but he's going to go out there and give his home crowd something to cheer about. And as you see, he's one of the most hunted down in terms of in the the swimming pool because no one can touch him. He's a little bit like Michael Phelps, really. And as we move it into the athletics stadium, we've got the likes of Marcus Rain. He's a German long jumper. He's the Paralympic champion, and over recent years he's actually been jumping distance that would allow him to actually compete against able-bodied athletes, although he has actually not been allowed to compete in the Olympic Games. So he'll be one to watch because he's hoping to potentially qualify at the World Championships at able-bodied competition next year. And then finally, have to mention Tatiana McFadden. She's one of the great American hopes, competing in 7 events, hoping to win gold to add to the 3 she won in London 2012.
Kate, thank you very much. Kate Gray there, who is herself a former Paralympic swimmer. Well, you'll remember Russia received a blanket ban on attending the Paralympics because of a state-sponsored doping scandal, so Russia has decided to hold its own event. An opening ceremony has already taken place in Moscow for a Russian competition described as the alternative Paralympics. The BBC's Oleg Boldarov was at the ceremony.
As Paralympic Games about to open in Rio, here in Moscow, something we can call consolation games, a special event for Russian Paralympic squad, which was banned from Rio. A colorful ceremony here greeting all teams in track and field, fencing, archery, rowing and other sports. It's a 3-day event which will involve 260 Paralympic athletes from Russia. Of course, they are disappointed. And this thing is bigger than Rio.
Of course, the mood is ruined. We were preparing for a sporting battle, and now we have to wait. We prepared for 4 years, and for some, this shock is enough to make them consider quitting sport.
So what are Russian Paralympics going to do now that there is no certainty in their sporting schedule? Well, most of them say they will stick on, they will fight on, they're hoping that a decision, the solution will be found soon. But at the moment, all they have is this 3-day event in Russia. Oleg Boldarov, BBC News in Moscow.
Let's have a look at some of the day's other news stories. Philippine officials say President Rodrigo Duterte and President Barack Obama have met informally at the gala dinner at the ASEAN summit in Laos. Relations between the two men had soured after President Duterte used offensive language when referring to President Obama. It led to President Obama cancelling a formal meeting scheduled for Tuesday. Denmark will buy data leaked from the law firm at the heart of the Panama Papers scandal. The country's taxation minister has announced over 11 million documents previously leaked from Mossack Fonseca to international media revealed huge offshore tax evasion. In this latest development, an anonymous offer to sell data involving up to 600 Danish citizens was made over the summer to Denmark's tax authorities. There are reports of a bomb attack on the besieged Syrian city of Aleppo a day after dozens were hospitalised after a suspected chlorine attack. It comes as Syria's main opposition groups meet here in London trying to find a way to end the civil war. Our Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen sends this report from the capital Damascus. You may find some of these images distressing.
Another air attack on East Aleppo, which is held by an assortment of rebels. Civil defence workers pulled out casualties, as they've done countless times before. The attack was close to the place where local reports say bombs containing poisonous chlorine gas were dropped on Tuesday. The Syrian government always denies using chemical weapons, despite many accusations. This side of the city is at the moment the government's biggest target. The Syrian army is trying to surround East Aleppo to seal it off, an attempt to impose a siege to starve out the anti-regime forces that control it. Casualties were taken to one of East Aleppo's makeshift hospitals. The fighting and attempts to impose a total siege mean they're short of medical supplies. The regime blames the bloodshed on foreign countries intervening to destroy Syria. It denies allegations it rigs elections here and says President Assad has no plans to leave office.
We elected our president, we elected our parliament, we elected our local administration units, but these Western countries would recognize only what they want or the results they want. So we have a very strong government. We have sustained a 6-year war against Syria, and I assure you we shall continue as long as the intervention takes place.
In London, backed by Britain, the Saudis and others, A Syrian opposition coalition has produced the most detailed blueprint yet for a transition of power, insisting on President Assad and what it calls his clique leaving. They don't expect a yes anytime soon from Damascus.
If Bashar al-Assad continues to be obstinate and continues to drag his feet and continues to refuse to engage seriously, then obviously there will have to be a plan B, which would involve more stepped up military activity.
This is the center of Damascus. This part of the capital could not look more different to the east side of Aleppo. There's huge war damage only a few miles away and across the country, but this is the regime showcase. Now, if the demand to step down had been delivered by a victorious army at the gates of his palace, President Assad would have had to have listened. But the way things stand now, he doesn't. The era of the Assads in Syria seems to be far from over. Hair-raising rescue journeys have been happening every day in this country for more than 5 years. These were civil defense workers in rebel-held East Aleppo, racing to save casualties in Tuesday's attack that local reports say contained chemical chlorine gas. One Syrian general I've spoken to said the war could get much longer, perhaps another 10 years. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Damascus.
Well, our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, is at the Foreign Office in central London where those opposition talks are taking place. Lise, we heard there the Syrian government's view on foreign intervention as they meet there. What is the opposition's perspective on outside involvement?
We see behind me the briefing is just going on. The French foreign minister is talking to the French journalist who attended, or at least were on the sidelines of these talks hosted by the British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson with the Syrian opposition. They believe this is the best plan for looking forward to Syria's future. A very detailed, the most detailed they've ever presented for a security and a political transition that will ensure a stable transfer of power that will avoid the kind of collapse that has been seen in neighbouring states like Iraq and in Libya. But yet again, you see the French foreign minister is here. There were more foreign ministers from the West and from the Arab world inside the Foreign Office today. This is a conflict which draws in more outside powers than any other conflict anywhere in the earth. And we've been hearing reports today that the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been speaking to the US President Barack Obama, possibly Turkish troops moving further into northern Syria and helping in the attack against one of the last places held by so-called Islamic State in Raqqa. That will be a controversial move, despite what is a huge priority for the West and indeed for all Syrians, is to get rid of the last of Islamic State in the territory of Syria as well as Iraq.
Lise, we've had so many years searching for a peace process. What, if anything, is different about this time?
Well, no one expects Syria to go to a negotiating table anytime soon. What is new about this plan is the kind of detail it includes, and it's meant to be an answer to those, including the Russians and the Iranians, who say, well, if President Assad goes, Syria would collapse. Now they're saying, we have a plan. We have a plan to keep the institutions in place, and we also have a plan which will include some members of the Syrian regime, but not all, and not President Assad. I've been speaking to the Syrian opposition spokesperson, Salam al-Meslit.
No, we don't expect Assad to come to us and say, yes, I'm moving out. No, I don't think he will. But that's why we're here. We want to hear from our friends that really there are, in this world, there are decision makers, and they can really make a change in Syria. Russia is playing a big role there. Iran is playing a big role, but unfortunately, negative. They are against the Syrian people. Russia is taking advantage of this situation because they know that Mr. Obama only has, a few months and he wants to do something. And we don't want them to do anything against our people there.
You don't trust the talks now taking place between Secretary of State John Kerry and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov?
It's not the American side we don't trust, but we fear that they will listen to the Russian and agree on what the Russian says. The Russian, they work for the regime, they want to do anything for this regime, not for the Syrian people. That's our fear, but we hope that the American would be aware of that, because it's things will not end when this administration leaves the White House. There is a new administration, but at the end
It's American policy, foreign policy, and they have to really do things right. They should not really trust the Russian when it comes to agreement on Syria.
Opposition spokesman expressing some concerns, some worries about those talks between Sergei Lavrov and John Kerry. But in the last few hours, we're getting reports that they've made some progress. And there's talk even of a deal by Friday, which would be about a temporary truce across all of Syria. If that happens, it would provide a small speck of light in a very, very dark war.
Lise, thanks very much. Lise Doucette, our chief international correspondent there at the Foreign Office in central London. There are concerns over the future of London's status as a global centre for nightlife after one of its biggest clubs, Fabric, was shut down. It's had its licence revoked after the deaths of 2 teenagers from suspected drug overdoses. Half of London's nightclubs have closed in the last 8 years, Tolu Adeyoye reports.
For nearly 17 years, it's been at the forefront of London's clubbing scene, hosting the biggest DJs, attracting international crowds. But the party's over at Fabric nightclub. Today there were flowers outside after news that its licence had been revoked over concerns about drug use at the club. Its owners have called the decision a travesty.
Yes, it's a shock, and we're absolutely devastated for all the people involved. We're devastated for the consequences of it. But more than anything, we're frustrated and angry. Airports aren't held responsible for drug mules coming through every day. The Calais ferry isn't responsible for people trafficking and all the hundreds of tons of contraband that they transport across the channel every week. No one is held responsible for it, but they just pick on nightclubs and things because we're a soft target.
The club was already temporarily closed after the deaths of 2 teenagers over the summer. In deciding to shut it permanently, Islington Council said there was a culture of drug use which the management and security appeared to be incapable of controlling. The Metropolitan Police argue keeping Fabric open could cause more drug-related deaths. There have been 6 here in the last 4 years. 5 of them were under 25s. But supporters of the club say Fabric does all it can to prevent drug use and that the problem will now just move elsewhere.
Shutting the doors in this club isn't going to stop those young people going and doing drugs. They're just going to go and do it in the park or somewhere else. In this club, there were 4 medics. There's a resuscitation team. Many people's lives have been saved by Fabric's professionalism. They will now be out in the street or in a park or in a pub that doesn't have any of those facilities. Does that really solve the problem? I don't think so.
50% of nightclubs have closed in London in the last 8 years. The city's mayor, Sadiq Khan, says he's disappointed by the Fabric decision at a time when he's trying to promote the nighttime economy. A fund has already been started to help the club launch an appeal. Tolu Adeyoye, BBC News.
Now another year, another iPhone.
It's the best iPhone that we have ever created. This is iPhone 7.
Well, there it is. Apple unveils its latest handheld device it hopes will dominate the smartphone market again. With me, our technology reporter Chris Fox. Chris, you are still listening to what is coming out of this launch. Tell us more.
Yes, they're just announcing everything now, although they accidentally did let some of the details slip on Twitter earlier today, so they posted a picture that they probably weren't ready to do. But the latest things are the phone's going to be water resistant, so you can take it into the bathtub if that's your thing. Also, as rumoured, it looks like the headphone socket is going to disappear, so your old headphones that you're used to using on your computer or on your laptop, they won't fit in the phone, because that had to go to make the phone water resistant. It also has a new dual camera on the 7 Plus phone, 2 camera lenses in the back rather than 1. That's so they can do some quite clever things, like one of them's wide angle, so you can take a picture of all your friends with everyone in, and the other lens is close up. It's zoomed in a little bit, so you can take pictures of things slightly further away. They're the new features on the phone.
They're new features for Apple. Has anyone else done any of this before?
Well, actually, yes. They're billing it as a revolutionary phone, as Apple always do. Samsung's top handsets have been water resistant for quite some time, and the dual camera thing, actually, there's already some phones out there with 2 different cameras. So the LG V10 has a dual selfie mode, so you can take a wide-angle selfie around the dinner table with all your family and also regular selfies. And there's also a phone by Huawei which has got a dual camera in the back, and what that lets you do actually quite cleverly is refocus a picture once you've taken it. So if you took a picture and you weren't happy with the bit that was in focus, it can calculate and work out the depth and actually refocus things a little bit. Apple have just said that their phone is revolutionary because it can do that too. It can blur the background and keep you in focus. Well, not so revolutionary. It's actually already out there on some other Android handsets.
Chris, we'll let you get back to listening to what Tim Cook is saying. Thanks very much for that update. It is official. The iPhone 7 is now out. Now, barely a day goes by without Russia's President Vladimir Putin being mentioned in the contest for the American presidency. On Tuesday, Donald Trump claimed the Russian leader looks at Mrs. Clinton and laughs. The day before, Hillary Clinton accused Mr. Trump of having a bizarre attraction to dictators, including Putin. So is Donald Trump the Kremlin's man? Who would Russia like to see in the White House next year? Our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg reports.
Outside the US Embassy in Moscow, it's a modern version of War and Peace. Maria is not exactly Tolstoy. She's a pro-Putin activist. And, as you can see, she's pro-Trump too. And just to prove it, she's brought along her Donald doves. As Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton caused a new Cold War, Maria says. Trump as president brings hope of a new world order. And from the sound of things, Moscow stands to benefit.
Wouldn't it be nice if we actually did get along with Russia? Wouldn't it be nice?
And a President Trump may recognize Crimea as part of Russia.
I'm going to take a look at it. But, you know, the people of Crimea, from what I've heard, would rather be with Russia than where they were.
So is Trump Moscow's man? The Russians deny it.
Because we're not involved anyhow in this campaign. We're not supporting Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, or others, politicians or people in American policy in any sort of domestic elections.
And yet, if you take a look back over the last 100 years or so of Russian history, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Russian leader and a US presidential candidate who have more in common, a more similar view of the world, than Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. And since Trump says nice things about Russia and its leader, while Hillary Clinton is more hardline on Moscow, it's not surprising that polls here show more Russians want him to win than her. No one sings Donald Trump's praises louder than Russia's most famous pop star.
Oh, Donald Trump. Oh my God.
Philip Kirkorov has known Donald Trump for more than 20 years. He was one of the judges at Trump's Miss Universe contest in Moscow.
If Donald Trump will be president, the relationship between our country will be much, much better, closer, and I pray for that, because I miss something very special between Russia and America. I miss it, because two big nations, two big countries, they must be friends.
Donald Trump called him Russia's Michael Jackson, and he's hoping to call Trump America's president. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
Well, that controversial trip by Donald Trump last week to Mexico has brought about the resignation of Mexico's Finance Minister, Luis Videgaray. Mr. Videgaray was widely seen as the politician who coordinated Mr. Trump's meeting with President Enrique Peña Nieto, which has angered Mexicans. The US Republican candidate has vowed, as you'll know, to build a wall along the Mexican-American border and make Mexico pay for it. Get in touch with us about any of our stories here on BBC World News. I'm at KarenBBC on Twitter. Thanks very much for watching the programme.